Hello, and welcome to our Lunar Reflections podcast, where we'll be journeying with the moon while Jupiter's in Cancer. Each month, we'll release an episode to coincide with the new moon. And this month, there's a new moon in Sagittarius on the 20th of December. I'm Helen, an astrologer from Scotland in the UK.
And my name's Tara Stevenson. I'm a British astrologer.
Great, and today we'll discuss the new moon itself, have a bit of a conversation around the moon in Sagittarius more generally. We've got a couple of interesting famous Sagittarius moons to talk about, and we'll end on some practical ideas for engaging with this new moon. Tara, do you want to kick us off with a general introduction to the moon in Sagittarius as a natal placement?
Sure. So Sagittarius moon is mutable fire. And when I was kind of thinking about an analogy, I guess if Aries is the bonfire and Leo's the sun, Sagittarius are the fireworks. Like once they go off, they don't really know where they're going to land. And I think that unpredictability kind of relates back to when we think of the archer and which is the symbol of Sagittarius, kind of aiming to the sky. It's kind of that expansiveness. And I will try not to use the word expansive throughout, but it does kind of sum up Sagittarius for me. I mean, I think about visionaries, truth seekers, boundary pushers. I think that people with Sagittarius moons create their worlds out of like their inner landscapes. And even if their lives are turbulent, the mean making impulse is very huge. And I think I didn't realize how many kind of visionary Sagittarius moons there were, and doing this research for this episode has really helped me. So I'm just going to list some of them now because I think it's really interesting. So we've got Stephen King, we've got Anthony Hopkins, Judy Garland, Freddie Mercury, Yoko Ono, Ted Bundy, Albert Einstein, Umberto Eco, Neil Armstrong, Victor Hugo, Charles Dickens, Lewis Carroll, Mozart, Beethoven, Van Gogh, Picasso, Darren Aronofsky, and a certain president that shall not be named. And I think when you think about all of these, there's definitely this, like I said, a need to kind of express their inner world. I think people like Stephen King, who I'm a great fan of, like create work that feels like, I don't know, trying to escape their own psyche, but then infiltrates your own. They leave like a piece of them with you. And when we think about Sagittarius moons, because they're ruled by Jupiter, the emotions don't come in half measures. It's almost like amplified feelings. When you think about really volcanic performers like Judy Garland and Freddie Mercury, and then you've also got these dark extremes like Ted Bundy and the president that shall not be named. I think this is a reminder that Sag Moon archetypes can be amplified for better or worse, um, especially if the psyche is wounded or distorted, whatever. It's like whatever Jupiter touch expands, and so that everything is amplified, the good and the bad. I think there's definite kind of sense of destiny. Like when I think about my own, like I'm here to do something, it's kind of like a real deep emotional need to do something, especially around meaning and how life can mean something bigger than, bigger than ourselves. The shadow side of Sagittarius moon, I think, is overindulgence. I'm thinking about myself here, like can be overly hedonistic, dogmatic. Um, Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning my emotions. I think we naturally associate water signs with emotion, but when the moon is ruled by Jupiter, there's this expansiveness that seems to kind of be infinite. And I'm talking about both Pisces and Sagittarius moons here. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on Sag moon generally. What's your experience of it?
Yeah, that's lovely, Tara, and we'll come back to ask you a bit more about your own moon in Sagittarius as well, because I think that that's another level of really valuable insight. Um, for me, I think I've got Sagittarius placements, but not the moon, so it's kind of pulling together my awareness of those archetypes to understand it. But certainly, one word that was in my mind that you mentioned as well is seeking, and that aligns with the arrow symbol as well. But it's that sense of really shooting for the stars and trying to seek to understand the greater meaning of life, really. So there's this another cliche around the most philosophical sign, and I think there's something to that in that sense of seeking out a greater meaning and deeper meaning and truth seeking, even though we also associate truth with Scorpio, but it's kind of different in Sagittarius case. And then another
Mhm.
one, the condition of Jupiter obviously makes a big difference. But to risk another cliche, I think there can be a sort of theme of optimism and faith with the placement, and that might not necessarily mean that it's there and it's good, but it's definitely a relevant factor. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think you've touched on something really key around the optimism. And I don't know if it's because I also have Venus square Neptune, but I think my optimism can sometimes mean that I don't always have a groundedness in kind of reality because I'm always thinking of the possibilities, the end possibilities, and there's like just a naivety, almost like a hope for something that doesn't exist. It can be hard to sometimes, like sometimes that fall back to earth that can be jarring and disconcerting. And so I do love having that optimistic kind of outlook, but I think sometimes it can cloud your judgment. And so you have to kind of, and like with Jupiter, because it's so big, and when it's the moon, it's just like you kind of get carried away with the emotion. So I've definitely been burnt in my life with just being too optimistic. So yeah, you have to, I'm learning now as I get older to like think, okay, what's the reality of this? And try and like counteract and just find that balance.
Mhm. And just another classic one as well is around adventurousness and a sort of orientation towards new experiences, and whether that's intellectual or more kind of traveling the world. And I always think you have to be a bit careful where some significations come from, because in some versions of 20th century astrology, people conflated the signs with the houses, and some of the ninth house significations got kind of associated with Jupiter and Sagittarius. But then I do wonder if, because there's that kind of curiosity for deep meaning, and there is an expansiveness, broadly defined because the association with Jupiter. And that was something that came through in the famous person example that I've got anyway. And I don't know what you think about that as a kind of keyword, if you like,
Yeah. So do you mean expansiveness or?
adventurousness.
Oh, adventurousness. Yes, sorry, that's what you said. Yeah. I I mean, I had those, my mum had to have those reins for me, otherwise I'd be off. Like as soon as I could actually walk, I just always wanted to be off exploring. And if I didn't have those reins, then I just would not be anywhere near where I was supposed to be with my mum in terms of I was just always exploring. There's like a fear, and I don't know if it's obviously I've got like quite a lot of fire in my chart. So there is just like this sense of independence and need to feel free. And I think the link to adventurous is needing to feel free, not feeling tied down, and that's like emotionally and physically. So I think that need to explore and just keep the mind active. Like this is the Gemini Sagittarius axis, this like need for constant like new adventures. I think it does reflect the need to also just be free to roam. And I definitely have a sense of needing I think Sagittariuses are very good at doing things solo. I mean, obviously they can do it in groups as well, but I think, yeah, there's this need to go off. And I think adventurous is a perfect, I know it feels like a cliche, but they're there for a reason because it's, my lived experiences, even now. I mean, obviously I don't need reins now, but there's also, there's sometimes I can feel claustrophobic. I think that's a word that I can often feel like I just need space.
Yeah. And the image that's coming to mind when you were talking there is the metaphor of the need to spread one's wings, which is another
Hmm.
expansive kind of image, but actually I like that as a phrase for when we feel like we need to push ourselves a bit more, grow a bit more past something. Sometimes that does mean getting a bit of space from others so you can go out on your own on something. And yeah, that's almost bringing an expanding metaphor back as well, which fits really well with the Jupiterian rulership.
Yeah, no, for
And
sure.
yeah, I was just thinking that brings us nicely perhaps onto the new moon chart for the Sagittarius new moon on the 20th of December. And this one is taking place at 28 degrees Sagittarius. So it's in the kind of later degrees in the malefic ruled terms and bound kind of area. And I think there's a few things that are quite interesting about that chart. And if it's okay, I'll suggest a few and then just invite you to give us your thoughts on it as well.
Sure.
So in the UK, at least where I am, it's probably similar for you. It's a kind of early morning chart about 2 a.m. So this is under the horizon taking place, and we've got mutual reception with that exalted Jupiter in Cancer, which is really angular on the midheaven as well. That's going to be quite a nicely supportive dimension of this. And it struck me as well that the square from Saturn Neptune in Pisces, also ruled by and trimed from Jupiter, but still in an active square with that new moon, might bring a bit of kind of, more of a tense aspect to it. Also, we've got the new moon. I couldn't help noticing it's co-present with Mercury, but unlike the last new moon, it's not conjunct. And it's also sitting on the midpoint between Mars and Venus. So there's almost this maybe an opportunity to balance those types of energies, the more the kind of going out there versus attracting things to us, the being versus doing, if you like, going out to get what we want versus kind of waiting and allowing things to come to us, and almost that masculine and feminine principles. So I think that was quite interesting. And the only other thing that jumped out to me as well was that Jupiter, although it's in that fantastic position, it's got a really tight square from Chiron in the seventh house, so just setting in the UK, which I don't know if there's maybe some overtones there or opportunities for emotional healing as part of it. What do you think, Tara?
Mm, yeah, no, that's a really good point. And, I do usually pick up Chiron, but I don't know, I was kind of distracted by everything else. But I think that square is important because it's something that we're kind of experiencing now in the build up. I should say that we're actually recording this on the Gemini full moon. I don't know if that was absolute chaos or whether that's just how it should land. But yeah, it's actually when I look at the chart, it's to the degree there because they're both at 22 degrees, Chiron and Cancer. And I think just want to pick up on your point around the fact that this is a late degree chart. It's literally Capricorn season starts like the next day. And since we've started this podcast, we started off with new moons almost ushering in the beginning of a season. And because of the timings, it's now switched to the end of a season, which I think is really interesting. So we would have already gone through almost all of the entirety of Sagittarius season. And I think it's quite fitting that this last new moon of 2025, it's almost like Saturn is the star of the show because we're going to have all of these squares in December. I think this Saturn square highlights that there's going to be more of a sobering effect to this Jupiterian optimism that we've been talking about. I think it's calling us to really kind of slow down. I think Jupiter wants to do all of the things all of the time. And I think when I reflect on Saturn, is here to kind of just say no, especially ahead of, the fact that we're going to move into Capricorn season a day later. We're heading for this like back-to-back Saturn seasons in the darkest time of the year. And, when we think back to the beginning of December, we have this whole raft of squares. So we have the Saturn square in Mars on the 9th. This is exact. And then on the squaring the Sun on the 17th, squaring Venus on the 19th, squaring the new moon on the 20th, and then squaring Mercury on the 30th. And it's interesting that we have Saturn ruled by Jupiter. So it feels like Jupiter and Saturn are almost the big players in this chart. Um, and I do think it's interesting that Jupiter is kind of, for us anyway, in the UK, almost to the second on top of that MC. So it's interesting. It's a bit of it's a bit of an enigma, this one, because, we've got this exuberance of Jupiter that wants to do all of the things. And I do think Saturn's going to have this real heavy kind of influence, especially with kind of Neptune there as well. I think it's kind of promising to be magical in a way. Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out exactly how all these Saturn squares are going to kind of build upon that story.
That's a complex one to pull together, isn't it? It's almost like,
Mm,
and as you say, I think that's a lovely point, just going into Saturn season, really just on the precipice of it. And Saturn is it seems to want to end its transit through Pisces with a bang, just with all those squares you just described, really kind of sharpening our attention to certain things. So that could be an opportunity. But as you say, with Saturn Neptune, it can be built making a dream reality, and it can also be disillusionment. And I think there's some kind of complex vibes there. The other thing that struck me, because as you said, just about to move into Capricorn season, and Mars is kind of leading the charge there. It's already exalted in Capricorn,
Hmm.
and it's actually conjunct this new moon. It's a dissociate
Yeah.
conjunction, but it's like 5 degrees of orb, and so I do wonder if that's adding a bit of a hard edge, and or maybe a little bit of get up and go energy, get things done. That can be something that Mars and Capricorn can be quite good for sometimes.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point with that Saturn ruled Mars. We haven't had, we had a bit of a rough Mars year last year with like that like terrible, horrible retrograding Cancer. And, it was literally a relief when Mars was finally domicile again in Scorpio. We've had kind of, yeah, it's been in Sagittarius, but I am looking forward to it moving into Capricorn. And I think the fact that it is this out of sign conjunction just reinforces that, it's time to kind of look inward rather than look outward. And I think we've had this kind of grand trine, this water grand trine, and obviously things have slowly moved out of Scorpio. So, but we still have this kind of Saturn, Jupiter trine going on. And the fact that they're both ruled by Jupiter just kind of reinforces that message. So yeah, it will definitely be an interesting one. And obviously it's just before Christmas, the festive season as well, where there can be that kind of, I don't know, desire to let go and overindulge and drink and eat and be really indulgent. And then, but Saturn's kind of just there. I can feel the
Yeah,
presence now, even now while we're recording it. Like, with anything, you've got the perfection, like the exact, but you've got the applying, and sometimes even the applying of that transit can feel bigger than the actual, culmination when it perfects. So yeah, an interesting one for sure. I think December is, yeah, just ending on that kind of sober note, but it probably is needed because obviously Saturn is going to move back into Aries, and so it's kind of gearing up for that, I think.
yeah, maybe tying up some loose ends of whatever the
Hmm.
story has been, or transits, and collectively as well. Yeah, I think
Definitely.
that's thanks, Tara. I think that's really useful. And just circling back, because I think we touched on it a bit already, but I wondered if before we move on to thinking about the notables with Sagittarius Moon, obviously we've got the benefit of your personal experience, and I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more on just your emotional nature as a Sagittarius Moon and your lived experience of that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you touched upon it earlier, but obviously, if you have a natal Sag Moon, you're currently in mutual reception with its ruler Jupiter in Cancer. And essentially, that's the reason this podcast idea came to me. Cancer and Sagittarius are in conjunct, they don't see each other, so they don't have an awful lot in common, yet they're connected by Jupiter, which then actually brings them very close together. The spiritual downloads I've had have been absolutely profound, like passing through my 12th house. So my Sagittarius moon is at 1 degree. It's in the fifth house. So there's definitely an emotional need for self-expression, creativity, connecting with my inner child. And it might seem really weird, but there's an emotional need for fun and an element of risk. Like normally your moon is what makes you feel safe, and risk shouldn't feel safe because there's this uncertainty to it, but it literally kind of feeds me and it keeps me alive. And Sagittarius season always turns it up a notch. So my moon is making an out of sign conjunction with my fourth house Uranus in Scorpio. And I definitely have deep emotional memories of displacement, sudden moves, emotional instability, and hypervigilance. And I think I have a deep emotional connection to my roots because my moon is literally kissing the cusp of my fourth house. What's interesting is my due date. I was actually due to be born in September, which would have given me a Scorpio moon. And I actually am a Scorpio moon in sidereal. We've talked about this before. I feel like I'm an honorary Scorpio moon. And so
Yeah.
I want to kind of impress upon people that out of sign conjunctions have a place, and that to don't discredit them just because they're in a different house or a different sign. They're going to have that influence on each other. My Cancer Mars plus my 12th house is ruled by this Sagittarius moon. So it brings in this home and belonging as lifelong themes for me as well. I think I've had to, in my life, balance between the outward expression of the fifth house and the hidden depth of the 12th house. The fifth and the 12th, again, are in conjunct. They don't really see each other, but they're inextricably linked for me. You've mentioned traveling. I've had the privilege. It is a privilege. I've been able to travel the world for both pleasure and work. I've been able to go on solo trips as a couple, as a family, with friends, with work. I've experienced the whole range of traveling and exploring. I love and respect all cultures. I really enjoy submerging myself, and I do plan to live overseas one day. The rule of my ninth house is in the 12th, so it looks promising. Like, I'm hoping that will happen at one point. But yeah, an emotional need to just learn and gain knowledge. Like, I love studying. I have 3 degrees. That's not like me just boasting. It just soothes me to assimilate information and learning. I'm always looking at the next thing that I can kind of take on. So yeah, that's probably my moon in a nutshell.
That's great. And when you talked about that need for risk and how it kind of sounds counterintuitive, but then I was thinking back to, is that the flip side of those feelings of constrainment, which are really any feeling of being constrained or repressed is quite threatening, and therefore almost risk is a bit freeing. And I think you used that keyword as well, that sense of a need for freedom kind of fits with this almost there's a logic there that kind of makes sense in a Jupiterian way.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think there's an added layer of Sagittarius is generally a fun seeking sign, and then it's in a fun seeking house. So it's like doubled up. I think depending on where that Sagittarius moon is, will obviously have an influence. It would be very different if my Sagittarius moon was in the 12th house. Like, for example, you interestingly have Sagittarius ruling your 12th house, which again is a bit of a juxtaposition. So yeah, like I said, Sagittarius season I've had to this month just be like, your fifth house is being lit up. Do you need to make that impulsive buy? Do you need to make risky decisions? Like, I'm able to self censor in a healthy way, because I think when I was younger, when you're obviously like less mature, you just kind of do things on a whim and then think, why did I do this? So yeah, I've had to kind of temper, but it's always going to be there, this need to feel free. And even within the home, like sometimes I just need my own space. I need to be in my own kind, and I'm an only child as well. So I think, there's lots of layers when you kind of look at that need, that sense. But yeah, that need to feel free is what actually makes me feel safe.
Beautiful. And just a last question on that, because it occurred
Hmm.
to me to wonder, how do you think your Jupiter sign placement might modulate that, if at all? Does that play a role?
Yeah, do you know what? It's interesting because I've only really now started to think more deeply about its ruler Jupiter. And I don't know if it's because, but it's in Sagittarius, in Libra, sorry. So my Jupiter's in Libra, it's in the third house, but it's conjunct Saturn. So I have this Libra Jupiter Saturn conjunction in the third house. And I think that reinforces this need or thirst for knowledge because it's in that third house, ninth house axes, and how I kind of assimilate information. But I think what it does, and I think because Sagittarius can sometimes be very dogmatic and it's like my way or the highway, which I think sometimes I can be like that. But I think that Libra influence of Jupiter means that I'm quite open to lots of different ideas, and I can really balance kind of paradox. I hold paradox very comfortably. And because I'm very in like philosophy, psychology, all of the things, my Jupiterian kind of Libra can hold that space. It doesn't have to be one thing. Two things can be true at once. And I think that kind of feeds into that kind of Jupiterian aspect.
It's a nice balancing factor, and I'm thinking of that conjunction with the exalted Saturn in the third house as maybe being helpful for that discipline to get the degrees, and because the studying is what you can study without the structure and the
Mhm.
sort of the formal end point, etc., that comes with attaining a degree. I think that combination there, together with that openness for other cultures and other interest in new experiences and new knowledge and the meaning, would be really valuable.
Yeah, and I'm thinking back to when I first discovered astrology, like as we all do, you go in those rabbit holes, you do all those deep dives, but then I just knew I need formal training. I need to be able to get all of these scattered thoughts into some sort of structure. So I think you've really picked up a good point there. And that's when I enrolled in the Faculty of Astrological Studies, where, where we kind of first met and our kind of connection was grown. So yeah, I always need, even if I'm doing it on my own, some sort of like formalization. So I think that exalted Saturn in Libra conjunct Jupiter definitely speaks to that.
And then the other thing that just came to mind as well around the complementarity you've got there is, you mentioned about just an interest in and respect for other cultures. And I think exalted Saturn in Libra, especially conjunct Jupiter, probably has that sense of social justice and sort of social equality. And part of equality is mutual understanding, which again comes back to the third house placement and that kind of bringing that mental energy to it. So I think it's really lovely to see the way that even though they're averse signs, the way those are
Mhm.
working together through rulership.
Yeah, and I think that is a really good point. I think you can just discredit in conjunct because they just don't see each other, but then you can go beneath and look at all the different layers, and quite often there's more of like a nuanced or elegant kind of way in which they're supporting each other.
So in terms of that's your natal moon, Tara, we haven't checked in on your progressed moon in a while. So I was just wondering, where is it now and how's that been showing up in the context of the astrology weather we've been talking about?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you've asked because secondary progressions is such an elegant technique. I'm literally obsessed with it. I know you are too. So my progressed moon is in Cancer. So it's a 12th house Cancer moon, which is interesting given we've already talked about this in conjunction. And I've mentioned before this juxtaposition of the fifth house and the 12th house is quite poignant. I mean, preparing for this episode made me realize that my Cancer progressed moon is currently at 20 degrees. So it's conjunct Jupiter, its ruler at 24 degrees. And it moved into Cancer last June, and I want to just talk quickly here about the elemental switch and how abrupt it can be. My chart is pretty much all air and fire. So after a very wild 11th house Gemini moon, I did lots of online communities. I joined the astrology co-op. I went to Norwalk. It opposed my natal moon last June, when it moved into Cancer, I was mentally exhausted, and the Cancer moon was like a soothing balm. Like I've retreated, I've become a homebody, closed my astro readings, came off social media, was completely burnt out. I've had a lot of family dynamics come up for me. I did a talk on it, wrote an article on it. I featured as the Libra IC chapter in Palace's book. If you haven't checked it out, there's not much resources on the IC, but Palace Augustine's done a great job of like introducing us to the IC. I've been in lots of therapy. I think I'll be ready to emerge next summer when my moon progresses into Leo in my first house. And like I said, I think you have your progressed moon in an elemental sign that you're not used to, it can feel like you're, drowning in it. And I think 12th house is very much so accumulative, but it was needed. Like I just did too much when the Gemini moon, and I think it just activated my Sagittarius, and Sagittarius and Gemini is like, give me more, more, more. What else can I do? And yeah, I think this Cancer moon has been really good at just slowing everything down, going back to my basic needs. How do I feel safe? It's so funny. Like my word is of the year is like, let's get cozy. Where's the blankets? And it's like, that's my main aim, is just to be cozy and just to be at home. So that's very different to my chart generally. I'm all fire. I'm always wanting to be out and doing stuff. So that's been, yeah, it's been good for me, and I actually really appreciate that my progressed moon has been in Cancer. I think it's been exactly what I've needed for this kind of, yeah, introspective time.
It sounds like almost a bit of a reset, and I'm really hearing, both the sign placement, but both the house placement. Also, it struck me that the sign itself can be so loud because even when you were talking about that interest in family dynamics, and this is a general signification of Cancer and the moon, and so that's kind of really it feels like, especially with the dignity of the moon in Cancer, it's really coming through very loud for you. And you also talking about that reminds me that my own progressed moon is in Gemini, which is not an abundant element in my chart. And so there is almost a kind of a quite confronting element to that, because I think I'm the sort of air deficient chart there's different ways it can go. The person can completely avoid and dislike the themes of that element, or they can really, some say overcompensate. I think that's maybe a bit of a judgmental verb for it, but you can be very, very drawn to the contents of that element. So in my case, I'm the sort of air deficient person who owns thousands of books and has 3 degrees as well. And, that kind of love knowledge, love thought, love communication. And so the Gemini aspect has been interesting, but I guess because it's also my sixth house in whole sign houses, it's not really so much the fun side of Gemini. Although that said, I've been really deep diving on a lot of studies and things like that, and really hungry for knowledge and information, even
Mm.
more than usual, which has been really quite overwhelming. But I guess there is a fun side to other, I do
Mm.
enjoy it. I do enjoy learning skills and information and following the trail on a curiosity basis, like reading from one thing to the next and doing a deep dive and feeling that sense of almost exploration, not quite in the same way as Sagittarius, but of course it's interacting with my Sagittarius planets as it's doing it,
Mhm.
but in that kind of following the breadcrumbs kind of a way where you just kind of explore and learn new things and indulge curiosity as well. And I think that's been
Mhm.
one of the most positive things. So the Gemini full moon that's building as we're recording will be, I don't want to say exacerbating, it will be enhancing that.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think you're making a really good point there. And I think that kind of makes me reflect on the fact that we're talking about a mutable sign when we're talking
Mm,
about Gemini, when we're talking about Sagittarius. So it's like it's quite scattered. There isn't the structure isn't there. It's very scattered. Like you half start things. I mean, we're both neurodivergent, so there's probably that as well. But yeah, I think it really is such a good way when you've got to track your progress moon to understand exactly, especially what's lacking in your chart. You get almost like a free pass, like a little trial of experiencing a moon that you wouldn't necessarily normally experience. And so it's really, for anyone listening who wants to go down that route, it's a really good way to get a deeper understanding of all the different moons and how they express themselves. And you'll again feel that switch when it moves into Cancer, where it's at home. It will be in your seventh house, and that will have a completely different flavor as well. So I do really like tracking them and just seeing just how loudly they do kind of reflect. And it's something you can go back and look at. You can look at all your progress moons and be like, oh, okay, that makes sense why I did that.
yeah, exactly. And I would recommend it to anyone. And as you say, I think something really important there is it's accessible because you can start with the basis of which sign and which whole sign house is it in, but then you can start, deep as you work with it more, you can start looking at aspects to natal planets, aspects to other progressed planets, and so forth. You can get so much information just from what the sign is and how much affinity that has or otherwise with the natal chart. And obviously, with these techniques, we always ground it. The more you ground your analysis back in the natal chart, the more it fits. And whether that's a contrast or a complementarity or whatever that relationship is. So, that's a good catch up on progressed moon. Having chatted about that, I wonder if we could move on to our famous chart examples. Do you want to introduce yours first, Tara?
Yeah, sure. So, obviously at the beginning of this episode, I listed a long list of Sagittarius moons, but there was probably only one that I was ever going to do, which is a self-confessed special interest on Vincent van Gogh. And obviously, everyone's aware of his works, and actually, through being able to travel, I've been able to see his works in different countries, in different museums, both in Paris and Amsterdam, as well as London. So I've gone to quite a few of his kind of exhibitions, and just the more I kind of saw his art, the more I just felt really inextricably, I don't know, drawn to him. It's not just the vibrancy of his art that kind of pulled me in. I could just tell that he was like bearing his soul, like he had so much to get out in terms of like, I think it harks back to that internal psyche and needing it to, speak your truth. And I think he spoke his truth through art so amazingly. And my first Substack article was on Van Gogh. I just felt compelled to write about him. I did a lot of research, which actually took me to the place of his final days in Avers-sur-Soir, just outside of Paris last summer, which does sound a bit morbid, but it was so moving and compelling. You know, I went to the wheat fields, which he painted. I saw the crows, not obviously not the same crows. I saw, you know, his last final painting was of a tree with these kind of ruptured roots, which made me think of like the IC rupture. He's a Cancer rising. The final horizon he ever saw, and this place where his story ended but continued because people still go there. So, like I mentioned, he's a Cancer rising, so hypersensitive, deeply emotional, but also forever searching for safety and belonging. And when you read about his story, that's a key theme. And so, interestingly, his chart ruler is the Sagittarius moon in the sixth house. It's conjunct Jupiter and the South Node. And you know, I've mentioned before, you know, Jupiter expands, so his emotional world was big, it was larger than life. But I think this sixth house placement meant he lived with the constant grind, the constant effort, the sense that things were harder for him than for others, like a life of struggle. His art was his emotional labor, and with the moon in the sixth, he painted like he breathed daily, obsessively, compulsively. There was like moments when that's all he would do was paint. You know, he actually started painting much later in life. It's only a short period of window, sorry, that he actually painted, and it was very prolific. It was work, not a hobby. And I think the South Node there adds this kind of karmic heaviness. And although we're talking about the Sag Moon, there's some other bits in the chart that I think are really useful, like not useful, but really interesting. So he had this ninth house exalted Venus in Pisces, his love of color, light, dreamscapes, sorry. I think his emotional vibrancy shined through in his paintings, but also the fact he was obviously Dutch, but he fell in love with France. That makes sense because the ninth house is obviously foreign lands. Venus is exalted, so there's beauty, devotion, like this artistic, I don't know, transcendence in a way. And he lived and died away from his homeland, which is a very ninth house story. He's got a 10th house Aries sun. You said it's conjunct yours. When we think about Aries, it's doing things first. He was an artistic pioneer, and you know, Aries is very vibrant. I think his work is very fiery and reactive, and his fame was delayed as well. He was, you know, obviously everything kind of blew up after he died, but his solar legacy then became iconic. You know, everyone knows about him. What's really interesting is he has his 12th North Node in Gemini, and he was born a year to the day after his stillborn brother, also named Vincent. And I think that's a real 12th house North Node in Gemini signature, like the karmic
Oh,
twin, the shadow self, the ghost of this sibling that he replaced. I do feel like that he carried that subconsciously, obviously, because it was the 12th house. And we've spoken before about this. His Venus Mars conjunction literally sits at the bendings of the node. So, you know, the nodes obviously form an axis, and at 90 degrees, if you've got planets there, it's called at the bendings. And I think that was a place of tension, crisis. It's the eye of the storm. I think it perfectly describes that kind of artistic calling that feels, I don't know, urgent, consuming, ultimately overwhelming. And then finally, he's got this Saturn in the 11th house, which you also share. And I think there was this deep sense of loneliness in community. He longed for connection, but often felt like an outsider, even within like his artistic circles, which I think is kind of like classic 11th house Saturn. And I know I've like rambled on, but I just want to kind of end with, I think Sag Moons instinctively like weave their life experiences into these like mythic arcs. And I think Van Gogh is like the ultimate example of like lived experience, meaning, expression, legacy. I think he embodies nearly every kind of Sag Moon archetype, you know, seeking meaning through creativity, a need to express kind of an internal truth when the world doesn't understand, and this interplay between suffering, you know, you've got the sixth house, which is a difficult house, and revelation, and this almost, I don't know, photographic memory of color, light, and feeling, and a life that only made sense after it was complete. And I always kind of, I don't know, study his final painting, and you can just feel the pain in that painting. It's like it's just, you can just feel what he was feeling. So yeah, I have a very, very big soft spot for Van Gogh.
it's just an incredible chart. That's so interesting, Tara. And I think, I haven't spent as much time with it, but one of the things that jumped out to me that you did already say, but the moon conjunct Jupiter in Sagittarius, its ruler, on the face of it could be very, very good fortune. But as you said, it's also in the sixth house, conjunct the south node, kind of detracting from that a bit. And I'd sort of looked at the second house feature strongly in my example, so I'd kind of looked I don't know whether that natal promise has to be delivered during the lifetime, because it was his sister-in-law after his
Hmm.
death who kind of started selling his paintings. And as you said, it was relatively short and late career as a painter. And so it's interesting to think that maybe that fortune did come. He just, it wasn't part of his fate to actually experience it. And then another thing that jumped out to me is, the ruler of the fifth whole sign house is conjunct the MC and conjunct an exalted Venus in Pisces as well, but it is Mars. So there's this phenomenal creative drive, and almost like you mentioned downloads earlier, I picture him just like a receiver, just receiving all this
Hmm.
creative inspiration and just this need to get it out. And it would be interesting at some stage to look at you've probably already looked at the progressions and transits when he was going through that period, but it would be really interesting to know. Takes us away probably potentially from the Sagittarius moon, I'm not sure, but it really paints a picture of a Sagittarius moon conjunct Jupiter in a
Mm.
complex environment, in a with serious challenges. But from those challenges, Mars conjunct the midheaven is also coming inspiration and beauty and output and productivity and I guess empathy as well. With it being in water and the fifth
Hmm.
house being also a water sign, it's a fascinating chart example, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It is. And you could just search, you could just do, deep dives on it for days. I just love when you've got so much information at hand in terms of a person's life story, and then you have the chart. I mean, this is AA, so we know it's a accurate chart. And I think you're right. Having that Jupiter, the ruling of the moon, conjunct to the moon, there was just, I think, just this need to it, like, because there's so much, you can't contain it within your own body and your own mind. There has to be an outlet. And I feel like it was like almost compulsive the way that he painted sometimes. It's like he knew that he had to get it out. But I think you're right. Maybe there was this sadness because maybe he kind of always knew he was never going to achieve that outward fame in his lifetime. Whether, he could have predicted how much he blew up after is something different. But, he only sold a few paintings when he was alive. And I'm just so grateful that his family were able to, yeah, get it out to the world because it needed to be seen, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing example. And obviously, with the moon as being the ascendant ruler as well, it's just such a powerful planet within this chart. It's a brilliant example.
Thank you.
So I have a more ambiguous chart, and it just occurred to me that I'm also working on another famous person chart with no birth time, where I'm trying to rectify it, and I'm wondering if that's the progressed moon in Gemini also leading me to look at things where there's two ways of thinking about it. But this one is actually it's Charles Dickens, the famous Victorian literature author, and there are two A-rated charts, two charts with birth times in the Astral Data Bank that both have historical attestation. I didn't notice this at first, but I have looked at both and I'm very convinced by one of them. So in the 11:55 p.m. chart, has noted he's variably given his date of birth in letters as the 7th or the 8th of February, 1812, but also there was a memory that it was just before midnight. And so I felt like that kind of rang true for me. So worked a bit with that chart. And the reason why I think, and I'll talk about the Sagittarius moon in detail, and the reason why I think that's a convincing chart is to do with that Sagittarius moon, which would be in the second house in the 11:55 chart. Does that make sense? So I'll talk a bit around that and you can see what you think. But there's a particularly, and it's a bit similar in the sense that there's good historical data and it's nice to have detail about someone's life because there's a particular life event that occurred age 12 that makes me think that the second house makes sense in particular, but also just a general reading of the chart. So this is a Scorpio rising chart with it's got the moon conjunct Neptune in Sagittarius in the second house. And there's the ruler Mars is in the sixth whole sign house in Aries. So that does reflect the very strong personality that you had. But I think the Sagittarius moon conjunct Neptune comes through very, very strongly, regardless of the house placement, through the very, very compassionate works and empathy that was shown in Dickens literature. And that was actually, it's hard to overstate how influential that was on Victorian society at the time. He had this, even though he was propelled to stardom from around his 30s, early 30s, he became increasingly more successful and famous. That created some problems for him, but effectively he became very, very wealthy. He never lost his empathy for those who were down on their luck, and that traces back to a life event when he was just after he turned 12 years old. And Charles's father went to debtor's prison because he was unable to pay his debts. And this caused Charles to have to drop out of school at this age of just over 12 and get a job in a factory in London, moving out of the family home in Portsmouth where they'd been a middle class family. And this lasted about 3 months until the end of May that year when his father inherited some money from his mother who died and was able to pay his debts off and get out of prison effectively. What happened then was, and this has been another reason that experience was pivotal for him, it appears his mother didn't want to put him back in school. She wanted him to keep working. And he really felt that she was quite unsympathetic to his suffering, really. The privations of working in factories as a 12-year-old in London in 1824 were really considerable. And I think that's something you can get with Moon Neptune. You can get really creative imagination, sensitivity, and compassion for others, but also sometimes difficulties in the relationship with the mother. And interestingly, the ruler Jupiter in this chart would be in the eighth house opposite, and not quite in a degree based opposition, but in the opposite sign, and it's in detriment in Gemini. So you've got this second house, eighth house axis. And when we think about when you're 12 years old, you don't have your own taxes or usually inheritance or stocks or shares, or but your family's income could be the kind of eighth house significations. And around age 12, so I've got the exact date when this actually happened. We can think of there was a build up to it as well, where the family were selling off their furniture and silverware and desperately trying to hang on to their home and keep John Dickens out of prison. And during that time, that would have been his first Jupiter return, with Jupiter in detriment in his eighth house. And when it occurred, it was just inside Cancer. So it was exalted by then, still in the eighth Placidus house, but it was in the ninth whole sign house. But by that time, all of those events had occurred. But also I checked, and the progressed moon was making its way through Gemini at that time in his eighth house and kind of opposing the natal moon. And as well as that, Saturn was in Taurus. It would have been squaring the midheaven IC axis at the time. So that's maybe signifying the hardship and the pivotal moment in the balance between his future career and affecting everything about his future reputation and what he's known for in the world versus the home life. And obviously squaring, I should say as well, that the sun's also in detriment, conjunct the IC in Aquarius. So there would have been a Saturn Sun square during that time as well. I think that's quite a convincing rising sign and chart configuration, considering how very significant that experience was. And Dickens never lost, as I said, that experience and that connection with impoverished children in particular. Even though he wasn't the nicest person in some areas of his life, he always had that sensitivity and compassion.
Mm.
And as another, just one more anecdote to add to that, that I thought was really interesting is that he did actually travel a lot, and he was an early travel writer. He was given tours of the United States and he wrote extensively on it. He didn't approve entirely of the burgeoning United States and some of the inequality and impoverishment and enslavement that he saw. He was firmly against that. He wrote scathingly about it. And I think that's quite an interesting signification for, Moon and Sagittarius in general, but also conjunct Neptune.
Mhm.
There's
Wow.
sorry, jump in.
No, no, I'm just honestly, it's a really interesting chart. I've just been listening with fascination.
I wanted to mention something else, and this was my late night rabbit hole last night that I fell down. So, because
Yeah.
I thought with a Moon and Sagittarius so tightly conjunct Neptune, there would be that curiosity for meaning and experience, but also Moon Neptune contacts are often associated with some kind of interest in the paranormal or supernatural or spiritual areas in general. And what I was able to find out is that he did go to some illnesses. He considered himself a fascinated skeptic. So he went to illnesses. He actually was part of an organization called the Ghost Club,
Oh, wow.
which was originally formed out of Cambridge. It was a lot of very, very, successful people. It wasn't the kind of stereotypical ghost club we might imagine now, but part of what he committed money to was exposing frauds, and yet he seems to have had this curiosity. We know he wrote a lot about ghosts in his literature, mainly from a psychological component, again with that moon dimension, and he invented the Christmas ghost story as a genre. So he had them annually for a while. We all know A Christmas Carol. I think almost everyone knows the story there, and it's this coming to terms with compassion for someone in this, again, this theme of riches versus poverty. And I think that again speaks to or potentially speaks to that second house, eighth house axis. And yet, when you see that he had retained this common sense dimension to it, I think about his Mercury in Capricorn, and its ruler Saturn is exactly on the midpoint between that Sagittarius moon and Capricorn Mercury. I think of it like almost like the middle point of a scale with these two trays. One is the moon and Neptune's being drawn to and fascinated by the supernatural, paranormal, and areas like that, versus the Mercury in Capricorn, which is very empiricist and very kind of interested in grounding things in common sense. And the last rabbit hole that I fell down with this was that he considered himself an accomplished mesmerist, and mesmerism is not super well known, but it was originally invented in the 18th century, but enjoyed a resurgence in the Victorian era, shortly before, I think, the Neptune and Pisces transit, but I'd need to check. And it's a bit that hypnotism grew out of it as being when you stripped away all of the kind of more spiritual or paranormal, unexplained aspects of it, the parts that were acceptable to the medical establishment became what we now know as hypnotism. But there were at the time a whole suite of phenomena associated with mesmerism. And the idea was you could use it for healing, because the idea was there's this idea of animal magnetism and these energy flows that go through humans and animals, and some believed the world. And Charles Darwin certainly seemed to firmly believe he could help people and cure people using this. So I think that was I felt like that was a really nice kind of moon in Sagittarius conjunct Neptune tendency that's maybe a bit less well known about Charles Dickens compared to his literature work.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware about that bit, so I'm really glad you've brought it up so that people can kind of see the that he wasn't just a writer. And as you've been, I mean, there's so many points, but really quickly, I think that Moon Neptune is really loud, but it's also kind of supported because of that trine to his like exalted Venus, which Van Gogh also had. But there's Pluto in the South Node there. There's this heavy karmic intense influence to that kind of Pisces Venus there interacting again. And so we've got this Jupiter, which you've already mentioned in detriment, ruling both of the his exalted Venus and this moon, kind of bringing it all in together. And I think I was also thinking about when you said he went to America and then he was quite critical about different things. I think that Aquarius energy is very much about like how can I support the underdog? And, you said already around his kind of theme around impoverished children, which obviously harps back to his own kind of childhood. But I do think that Aquarius energy also is like, well, I'm going to look out for them if no one else can. And I also think even these is Capricorn, Mercury, and Saturn, which you've kind of mentioned, there is a theme of like hardship, isn't there, in a lot of his on a
Mm.
lot of his books. And I think that Capricorn element kind of shines through as well in like a different way. And we've both spoke about the fact that Great Expectations like left such a indelible mark on both of us. It's interesting that we both experienced it. I think you said about 10 years ago. I feel like mine was also about 10 years ago. I didn't read it as a child, and I want to recircle back to it because his emotional depth is able, and I think this is a Sag Moon quality, is just being able to really bring you into their internal world and psyche. And I think he did it brilliantly. And I'm really glad you chose to speak about his chart, because I'm going to add that to my list of charts to deep dive in, because it's extraordinary, to be honest.
It is great, isn't it? And the thing I won't go into in too much depth, because trying to, you know how it is with you can talk all day about these types of people and charts, but that you mentioned the Venus Pluto conjunction in Pisces squaring the Moon Neptune, and I think there's a lot there to do with his relationship with women, with his mother, with his wife, which were really, really difficult. And there's a sense of a real projection that he had onto his wife initially, but then later in life he was really, really indelibly drawn to younger, attractive women, which ultimately ended his marriage. And again, this is less well known because Catherine, his
Mm,
wife, was villainized in the press, and he led that. So there was an unsavory side to him as well. And I guess it's that duality you mentioned earlier about, we have to hold in our minds that person can be a great person and have great values that we respect and admire, and be philanthropic and make a big difference. And they can also have their dark side as well. And I think all of that kind of jumps out from this chart. So yeah, people can find out more about it. Just for time, I think it would be
yeah.
good to maybe move on back to the current Sagittarius new moon. And I wondered if, you had any thoughts on like practical ideas or ritual or reflections that listeners could use to maybe tune into the energy of this new moon.
Yeah, sure. And when I was thinking about this question, I just thought, let me think back to all the things I used to love doing growing up, because my moon obviously is in the fifth house, and I have a visceral connection to those things. And I think when you are able to reflect on like what gave you joy when you're a child, you can easily reflect that as an adult. I think we lose sometimes the ability to do that. So I've got a little list of things that you can do during either this new moon or just any Sag moon each month if you're wanting to kind of tap into that energy. So reading, I think losing yourself in a book is very Jupiterian. I know Mercury and Neptune also play a role, but that ability to go deep and lose yourself. If you just think about Alice in Wonderland, for example, by Sag Moon, Lewis Carroll, yeah, just I love like losing myself. And I think with the Sag Moon energy, I feel like it can kind of enhance your reading experience. Do something fun, adventurous. It doesn't have to be climbing Mount Everest. It could be anything that brings you joy, just like the simplest things where you get that sense of freedom and feeling alive. Stargaze, connect with nature. It reminds you that you're part of something bigger than yourself. Like I have early memories of just staring up at the sky and just being in absolute awe that we live in this universe. Like just having that. And it's nice to just not always be grounded in the reality of the mundane. Sometimes, we are a part of something bigger, and just having that connection can really strangely ground you. And then my other thing, which is more recently, is go for an omen walk. The universe is always in constant dialogue with you if you take the time to listen. I did one in October during my Sag Moon lunar return, and I simply asked, what messages do I need to hear? I think the more open-ended, the better. Like Jupiter doesn't deal in the details of the specifics. It just, just what do I need to hear? And then I went on a hike over our local downs, and it was amazing. I saw so many symbols like ladybirds, crows, mushrooms, rainbow. A peregrine falcon followed us for a while. But it doesn't even need to be in nature, although I do recommend it. It can be just walking in your city. What snatches of conversation do you hear? These are often messages as well. Just connect with the cosmos. It's always talking to you. And, once you start to have that dialogue, and everything feels, yeah, more special.
Perfect. I love that, because all of those things keep this commonality of like really connecting to the big picture, the larger context that we all operate in. That's very Jupiterian. And I think for myself, I'll try and get out and see some stars as soon as we have a clear Scottish night, without too many clouds. I'll take your advice and do that. Well, thanks. I think we'll wrap up there. Thanks, Tara, for bringing all of those insights, and to our listeners, as always, thank you for listening. Thanks for bringing your energy and attention to this topic.
No, thanks, Helen, and thanks for the thought-provoking questions. I've really enjoyed like talking about everything that we've done today. I hope the ritual and reflection ideas prompts everyone listening to nurture the spirit of adventure in themselves.
And we'll see you all next time. We'll continue our journey with the moon in Capricorn. Bye, everyone.
Bye.